Hi everyone, this is Dr. Mike, host of the free iTunes podcast, Psychiatric Secrets Revealed with Dr. Mike, but that's not why I'm here today. This is another Saving Savvy episode, and in this episode, I want to dispel the common myth that larger sensors create a shallower depth of field. They are involved, but they absolutely do not create anything with depth of field. So we're going to talk about that today, and I'm doing this because there's all these, even professional photographers that I hear saying, you must get a bigger sensor because it creates a shallower depth of field. I can't imagine they really think that, but maybe they do. But if you're a 101 photographer, I don't want you to think that. So let's look at a PowerPoint presentation. Normally I would do these really cheesy little drawings, but this is a little more visually complicated, so I'm going to go the PowerPoint route. So, hey, if you like my effort, give me a thumbs up. So here we go. All right, I even titled this. And it says full frame sensors do not create, note the word create, a shallow depth of field. So as we kind of move in our first slide, we can see two sources of light, a light bulb and a flashlight. And the light bulb illustrates something important. That light likes to travel from a source and radiate out in all directions in a fairly unfocused way. The flashlight solves this by putting a little mirror in the flashlight, and that reflects the light forward. And it makes a more coherent, I guess you'd say, beam of light. But we know if you've ever used a flashlight that quickly, that focused beam of light becomes unfocused. Here's another example using a lens. In this form, we're using a magnifying glass. And we've all had the little fun experience as a kid of taking a magnifying glass and focusing the sun on something like a leaf, hopefully to cause a fire. I know that's what kids do. But in this example, we're focusing on a transparent surface. So even though we can focus the sun on a discrete point, if that surface didn't block and stop the light, and the light went past the surface, it would start to spread out again, because that's what light likes to do. So we use that to our advantage in cameras. So our subject here is Ducky, and we want to focus on Ducky. But to focus on Ducky, we use a lens or a lens system, and that focuses the light on the sensor or the focal plane of the camera. And by doing that, we get a nice clear image. But is it so clear? Well, that's not true, because although we can focus on Ducky's eye and have a very precise point of focus there, and in fact, anything along that blue line will be in perfect focus, the rest of Ducky is really not in focus. So if you look at his little beak or his cute little tail, they're really not in focus. But to our brain, they appear to be in focus because our brain will tolerate small changes, maybe small defocusing points, and it will say, no, that's in focus. It's not that much out of focus. And we call the range between those two red lines the depth of field. And that is the range where things appear in focus to our eyes and to our brain, even though they're not. And we can vary that from being very shallow, that depth of field, to being really, really huge. So how do we change that? None of these involve sensor size. Well, one way is to change the focal length. So that's like using a 24 millimeter focal length lens versus a 300 millimeter focal length lens, or just changing it up. So in the bottom example, we're using a very long focal length, let's say 200 or 300 millimeters. And what that essentially does is we can completely focus on Ducky's eye, no problem, but you can see that the light really spreads out much more quickly than it does in the top example. So things become out of focus quicker. Top example, we're using that short sensor or that short focal length, and the light spreads out fast, but not as fast. So let's look at an example of that. So here we have a focal length, relatively small focal length of 17 millimeters on an APS-C sensor. And our can of Febreze, I know this is a really fancy setup here, but our can of Febreze is in focus. But the little cup behind the Febreze is sort of out of focus. So what happens if we increase the focal length? We, in other words, make that number bigger. It should make the cup blurrier. And indeed, that's what happens. Now, everything got bigger because we reduced our field of view. So the can of Febreze looks like it's bigger. I didn't move the camera or do anything like that. I just changed the focal length. narrower field of view, looks like it's magnified. And it's in focus, but look at that cup, completely or pretty out of focus. So that gives you an example of this first option. Here's another option, changing the aperture. So the aperture basically is the opening between the lens and the sensor. And we can use something called an iris to make that opening bigger or smaller. So what happens when you make the opening smaller, and we're still, Ducky has not moved, he's still in the exact same spot, we're still focusing on his eye, we're still able to perfectly focus his eye on the sensor, but when we make that iris or the aperture smaller, you can see that the light tends to disperse in a much tighter fashion than in the example above. So we would expect that a smaller aperture or a larger f number, remember f numbers are the opposite, so an f of 22 has a very tiny opening compared to an f of 2.8, which is a very big opening. So if we make that opening smaller, because the light's going to stay more, I guess we'd say coherent, much longer, we should have a larger depth of field. So let's look at that example. So we're going to go here. And so in this particular, we have the same setup, but we're using an f of 13, which is fairly small. The opening is small. And we can see that the can of Febreze is in perfect focus, but the little cup behind is, well, it's out of focus, but not by too much. So we would predict that if we make the opening much bigger, in other words, a smaller f number, the can should be in focus, but the cup should be out of focus. And that's exactly what happens here. So at an f of 2.8, much more light's coming through, the can's totally obliterated. Here's the third way. We can vary our distance from the object. So if we get much closer to the object without changing anything else, we're just getting in the object's face, so to speak, we still can focus that eye perfectly on the sensor, but look how much broader the light's spreading out. And so we can predict that the closer that we get to the object, the shallower the depth of field. So here's my son, and he's, I don't know, maybe 12, 15 feet away from that tree, and I'm roughly the same distance, so I'm in front of him 12 or 15 feet. And here I am taking his picture, and you can see that he's in perfect focus. Tree is slightly blurry. Let's just walk towards him. We're not going to change anything else. We're not changing sensor size, for God's sake, and nothing else. We're just walking closer to him. Okay, now I'm closer to him, and you can see the background is even blurrier. It's more out of focus. Let's get right in his face. Now I'm focusing on his nose, which is in perfect focus, but the depth of field is so shallow that his eyes are somewhat out of focus, his ears are definitely out of focus, and the background is completely out of focus. So just getting closer to the subject will give you a shallower depth of field. So we have three ways of changing the depth of field, and none of them involve having a larger sensor. We can increase the focal length to get a shallower depth of field, or of course do the opposite to get a broader depth of field. We can make the aperture larger to get a shallower depth of field, or do the opposite, which is to make the aperture smaller and get a bigger depth of field. And the same thing with this, we can move closer to the subject and get a shallower depth of field, or do the opposite. I'm not going to repeat that again. So what happens when something's out of focus? So this is complicated, not the topic, but the diagram. And so the blue lines represent focusing on Ducky's eye. And if we go to the sensor, we can see that his eye is perfectly focused on the sensor. But what happens if we move slightly out of focus? We go a little bit back behind Ducky's eye, represented by that triangle and the red lines. Well, if we go back to the sensor, and I've kind of highlighted it with a star so it stands out a little bit, we can see that the focal point for that particular spot is actually a little in front of the sensor. So where you get that perfect dot of light, it's not going to be on the sensor, and by the time the light reaches the sensor, and of course this is grossly exaggerated, the light's going to be spread out just a little bit. So why is that important? Oh my God, the circle of confusion. I love that title. Don't you just love circle of confusion? So this is actually a real term, and it involves how we perceive light. Now, typically the circle of confusion involves a print and a certain distance from the print and blah, 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 blah. I'm kind of changing this around a little bit, and this is not exactly true, but it's just too complicated for me to do that other thing in a short video. So when something is in perfect focus, it's a pinpoint of light. All right? But as that light spreads out, like in our example with the little red lines, it gets bigger. And there's a certain point where our brains will still say that that bigger splotch of light still is a pinpoint because we can't discriminate these really fine details. And when you reach the point, the exact point where the light no longer looks like a dot but looks like a splotch, we call that the circle of confusion. So as long as you're within that circle of confusion, even though the light is really out of focus, it's not that little dot, in our minds we're going to perceive it to be a pinpoint or in focus. The example on the right shows the light dot getting bigger, more out of focus, and at that point we would definitely say this is out of focus in our brains. And here again, this example. So here's Ducky, the focal plane. Everything along that line is in perfect focus. As we go towards either red line, we become more and more out of focus, but our brains can't tell the difference, so our brains say that it is in focus. Once we move past the red lines, our brains say, oh, that dot is too big, I know it's splotchy, and things are out of focus. And of course, we vary that area between the two red lines by the three things I just told you. So, why do full-frame sensors appear to have a shallower depth of focus? Because they have a wider field of view. And a smaller sensor would have to be further away from the object to get the same field of view. So if you're farther away from something, we know from the examples that I gave you that you'll have a much bigger depth of field and more things will be in focus. And when you have a full-frame sensor, this also can allow you to use lenses with longer focal lengths to get the same field of view that you'd get with a smaller sensor. So I might have to use a 50 millimeter lens with a smaller sensor to get that same image, that same frame up, but I could get away with using maybe a 100 millimeter lens with a bigger sensor. We all know the focal length, the bigger the focal length, the shallower. And again, all this stuff reverses in the other direction if you want a very broad field of view. So sensor size does not affect depth of field. The sensor is a passive receiver of focused light. Larger sensors are made from the exact same stuff as smaller sensors, silicon. There's no difference, there's no magic, there's no wizardry. If you crop a larger sensor to the size of a smaller sensor, and you don't change any of the other parameters, you don't change the focal length or the distance to the object, or you don't change the aperture, the blur is exactly the same. So here's an example. So I'm using a Nikon D600, which is a full-frame camera. I'm the exact same distance in both examples from the subject. I'm using the exact same lens, a Nikon 105 millimeter macro lens. And I have an f the same, which is 2.8. So here, since I'm using the full-frame sensor, I have a wider field of view, and I'm focusing on the tree, and you can see the background is blurry. Now I'm using a crop sensor. This is a Nikon D300S. It has 12 megapixels, half the megapixels as the larger sensor, but remember, we're cropping down, same lens, same f-stop. And again, you can see that the truck in the background is pretty blurry. But what happens if I sort of crop in on those? Now my cropping is not perfect, but here's crop 1, and you can see that things look very blurry. Here's crop 2. You can see that things look very blurry. What's the difference? The difference is that there is no difference. So that's the difference. So that kind of shows that. Okay, so there are ways to make a smaller sensor simulate what we see with a bigger sensor. And I've already told you what they are. We can adjust the focal length, we can adjust the aperture, and we can adjust our distance to the subject. And in some cases, we can get the exact same looking sort of setup or image. Sometimes we have to use a little finesse and maybe change things up a bit, but still get a similar looking picture. And if you're interested in knowing more about this, there's a site called DOF Master, I guess it's Depth of Field Master, and that site will allow you to put in various apertures and various focal lengths and various distances from the subject, and you can use different cameras. And if you want to, you can find the exact comparison between the two, like a larger sensor and a smaller sensor, and try to duplicate what you're seeing with that larger sensor. So what's the conclusion here? The conclusion is that sensor size does not directly cause a shallow depth of field. There's no magic in a larger sensor. It's really what shines on that sensor that makes a difference. And so it's really the lens and how close you are to the subject. And that combination of the larger sensor, which gives you a broader field of view, and what you can do with the lens can make a shallower depth of field. But it doesn't mean that the sensor is causing it. And in fact, we can approximate the same depths of field with a little finesse, even using a smaller sensor. Now, it would be pretty difficult if you're going to go from a full frame down to a compact camera size sensor, but I've seen people actually do sort of those things. So that's today's little talk. Let me get out of this screen here, and let me get back to so I can see my face. Oh, it doesn't want me to save this. We'll say save. And there I am again. So that's today's talk, and really it emphasizes this point. So if someone says to you that a larger sensor can cause a greater or shallower depth of view, give you a more blurry background, it's really just an indirect thing. It's really the other things that are happening that are causing that. So don't make that mistake. And if you get some time, please give my free podcast a listen. You can find it on iTunes. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. I should at least get that for the effort of doing all those PowerPoint slides. And as always, have a great day and subscribe.